Great. Okay, so I just started the recording. Excellent. Matthew Dahl is here from Yale. We've got Varun Magesh also on the line from Stanford. And I think Mirac and Daniel are here too. Both, and they're at Stanford as well, right?
Yeah, that's right. Mirac
Stanford
is here. Dan is not present, but he's on the paper.
in spirit, he's here. And all four from their respective law schools. So interested to hear from you guys. You are currently sharing screens, so go ahead and then we'll and as Elena said, if you have questions, comments, put them in the chat, and then we'll kind of put them together. Actually, there's not many people, so we might be able to field direct questions afterwards. Okay, go for it.
Great. Thanks, Joe. Thanks, Elena, for having us. Happy to be here to present our paper. And yeah, we can just jump right into it. So next slide. Great. So just to motivate the paper a little bit, large language models hold a lot of promise, we think, to transform the legal industry. This is not new. Everyone thinks that they're going to transform, finance, medicine, education, so on and so forth. But as lawyers, we're particularly interested in their effects on the legal industry. Sorry, could you go back just for a sec? Just to survey some of the things that they can do, we know that they can seemingly pass 1L courses. 1L is the first year of law school. They seem to score in the 90th percentile on the bar exam. The bar exam is a test that lawyers have to take in order to be qualified to practice law. It's illegal to practice law without passing this test. And they also seem to be able to perform what's known as IRAC reasoning, which is a particular mode of legal reasoning that's distinctive to legal analysis. It stands for issue, rule, analysis, and conclusion reasoning. And so obviously there's other research about other kinds of reasoning, causal reasoning, deductive reasoning that LLMs can do, but there's this interesting application to legal reasoning in particular. That all being said, there's a big problem. So next slide. Which is obviously this hallucination problem. Presumably most people here are familiar with this. You probably saw this headline from the New York Times last spring about a Manhattan lawyer who got in trouble for filing a brief with fake case citations that were generated from ChatGPT. Next slide. Here's another headline from SCOTUS blog calling out ChatGPT for erroneously claiming that Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who was a liberal justice on the U.S. Supreme Court, for dissenting in this case called Obergefell, which is the landmark gay rights case in the U.S. Needless to say, she did not write a dissent in that case. She was in the majority. So this is also a hallucination. Next slide. This is a problem in legal industry. Next slide. You may have seen this headline about the Fugees. If you're a fan of the Fugees, this gentleman got in trouble, or his lawyer got in trouble for using AI to generate his closing argument. He's now trying to use that as a basis for appeal. And then this headline just from a couple of weeks ago, Michael Cohen, if you're familiar with American politics, is a sort of associate of Donald Trump. And he is also getting in trouble for relying on AI. Next slide. And this problem is so widespread that even Chief Justice Roberts, who is the Chief Justice of the US Supreme Court and sort of sits at the apex of the American judiciary, talked about it in his annual report, which is kind of a big deal. He wrote, "Any use of AI requires caution and humility. One of AI's prominent applications made headlines this year for a shortcoming known as hallucination." Next slide. Sorry, back one. Yes, here. Thanks. So all this is to say, I think it's clear among lawyers, and we usually talk to lawyers about this research, why they should be caring about hallucinations. Obviously, they threaten the application of these tools for legal industry. They threaten access to justice. There's a lot of excitement that LLMs might, lower the cost of entry to practicing law and spreading legal information. But if they're hallucinating, that doesn't work. It's also possible that maybe hallucinations are a new kind of algorithmic harm. which has a technical dimension, but also has a legal dimension, thinking about liability for who should be held liable for hallucinations. But for this audience, I assume most of you guys are not lawyers. So I want to try to convince you that this research is still relevant for sort of ML and AI researchers writ large. And the idea here is that we think that a lot of existing QA data sets, question and answer data sets, truthful QA, hotpot QA, there's all these like sort of benchmarks that exist out in the CS literature. They're great, they're great, and people should be evaluating on them certainly. But they sort of lack correlates, metadata correlates that could be useful for learning more about sort of the interpretable behavior of large language models. And we think that legal data is actually perfectly suited to study LLMs as such, precisely because of the way that the common law works. So in common law systems like the US, the law is fractured and segmented across jurisdictions, across courts, across geography, across time. The law evolves differently in different ways. And exploiting this data lets us test hypotheses about the provenance of hallucinations. And so we'll hope to show some of the results of those tests here today. Next slide. And so exactly, so we asked the question, do LLMs know the law? Or in the words of Mr. Peanut Butter, what do they know? Do they know things? Let's find out. And here I'll pass it over to my comrade, Varun.
Thanks, Matt. So in order to kind of to create our data set of, so the way we set out to create this data set of legal questions that we can ask of these LLMs, record the responses, and record whether they're hallucinations or not to understand and characterize the overall hallucination rates of LLMs, and specifically, kind of as Matt pointed out, look at correlations to see what might be, in which areas LLMs might be more or less likely to hallucinate. We set about creating this database by asking questions about case law and about cases that we have references for in legal databases. So here, these are some examples of questions that we asked these models, including things like, what is the citation of a case? So that's like, given a case name, like if I say Obergefell versus Hodges, giving the like full reporter citation, which is like a page number in a specific book where that case could be found. And that's very important to like referencing your sources in the legal context, or asking kind of what the relationship between two cases, whether they agree or whether they disagree, or what cases ended up being cited or relied upon in a particular case. So these are all kinds of questions that lawyers might ask of these cases, and so these are questions that we ask of these models. We tested several different models, most prominently ChatGPT 4 and 3.5, and as well as Google and Meta's kind of flagship models. And we asked in total about 200,000 questions of each model, kind of spanning the levels of the American federal judiciary. So we asked about the Supreme Court, the circuit courts, the courts of appeal, and the district courts. One of the things that we found out very quickly when we kind of started to put this together is that there is really no widely accepted, singly used definition of hallucination. And we really find that there are a few different ways that people end up using this term. And there are a few different ways that we can choose to define this term that really help highlight what it is we're looking for and what the purpose of our research is and what we're looking for there. So in common use, we think that we see hallucinations really being like when people normally say hallucination in this context in other parts of literature, they tend to mean either this first category or this third category when the response from the model is inconsistent with the prompt that the user gave the model, or when the response is inconsistent with kind of the facts of the world. And the example tasks there are summarization and Q&A. And so these are tasks that are commonly asked of LLMs. And when LLMs err on these tasks, it's often referred to as hallucinations. Much of the focus in literature has really been on this first closed domain type of hallucination, when we ask LLMs to summarize documents, or kind of do reasoning puzzles based on questions asked in the prompt, and LLMs fail to respect or fail to be faithful to that prompt. We refer to that as a hallucination, and that's been characterized and studied pretty widely in the literature. And some areas that are less studied are kind of these more open domain hallucinations, whether um, uh, whether LLM responses are inconsistent with specific documents in the training corpus and specific facts of the world. I mean, the reason why we differentiate between those two is that we can imagine a situation where the training corpus doesn't align with the facts of the world, and the LLM can hallucinate in one reference context and not another. And this is very important in the law because legal documents and legal truths tend to change over time. So, for example, like if a particular, like this is an example we've tried out as well. If a case was overturned in very recent memory, past the training window of a particular LLM, it could in fact be a hallucination to say things about that case as if they existed, because that is not like within scope for the LLM. That's not within its training corpus, and so to make statements that are now true might actually be unfaithful, might actually be a hallucination with respect to the training corpus, or unfaithful to the training corpus. So we want to differentiate between those two because the validity of legal documents does change over time. And also that there are kind of contexts where you might want inconsistency with the training corpus where you wouldn't want inconsistency with facts of the world. So this is particularly in cases when in the law for kind of creative or unusual legal argumentation, when some degree of unfaithfulness to some lack of strict faithfulness to the documents in the training corpus may actually be a desirable quality in an LLM. And I think laying out this topology also kind of helps us clarify that there is some normative tension here. It's not just a technical problem that can be solved entirely. So there are many cases, there are real cases where we can imagine where the prompt and the facts of the world, or the facts of the world and the training corpus are in tension. And for example, when a user asks a prompt, or when the user prompts a model with information that is not consistent with its training data. This might be the case of kind of an untrained user making a kind of poor assumption or misunderstanding something and asking the model a question that's wrong, or it could be a trained lawyer telling the model to take into account a very recent case that the model doesn't know about, and insisting that that case is real and asking the model to take that into account. And we can't, and one model and one set of tuning may not necessarily differentiate between the two. There is kind of a normative trade-off that we have to make between kind of agreeing with the user, listening to what they're saying, or agreeing with the prompt and listening to what the prompt's saying, versus agreeing with the training corpus, listening to what the training corpus is saying. And we think this typology kind of highlights that. And yeah, and so in our work, we're really concerned about this last category of hallucination. What we mean when we say hallucination is that the LLM's response is inconsistent with the facts of the world. So that's mostly what we're interested in. And if we're talking about one of these other kinds of hallucination, we will mention it, or we'll kind of specify that we don't mean that definition for now. So this is a little bit more about our methodology, so how we're actually detecting these hallucinations. We draw on a few legal databases, including the case law. And so these are databases mostly focused on American case law, I should clarify. So we draw on these American case law databases, which contain huge, rich information about, or lots of rich information about millions of cases in the American case law, including kind of metadata about the case, like the name of the case, who wrote the opinion, but also more interesting information, like, for example, the Shepardization of the case. So how future cases have treated that case, or other cases that have kind of disagreed or agreed with what was said in that particular case. So we draw on this rich database, and we craft each of our questions by taking the kind of just the general information about the case and asking a question. That's pretty simple. Some of you are familiar with these commercial models, may remember our example slide up earlier and realize that the LM would never just respond Anthony Kennedy. It responds with some chipper filler, and then it says Anthony Kennedy. And we have a set of lots and lots of kind of scripts that are relatively simple, just using some regular expressions to pull out what we think are the kind of what is the core of the response from the LLM, and then we compare that with the actual answer that we know from the legal database. To be clear, however, this method applies to almost all of the most of our tasks and almost all of the 200,000 queries that we ask. But we also are interested in kind of more complex questions that can't necessarily be that don't necessarily have direct answers in a legal database. So we have and in that case, we kind of use a slightly more intricate methodology that really exploits the fact that that really exploits the fact that in some cases, when LLMs hallucinate, they tend to generate different answers or different kinds of hallucinations, whereas when they say the truth, they tend to repeat the same truth again when queried multiple times. Obviously, this isn't always true, and this kind of calibration isn't always actually tightly followed. Some LLMs tend to repeat the same falsehoods very happily, and so we really acknowledge that any findings here are really a lower bound on hallucinations. We know that when we query an LLM about a question multiple times and we see a contradiction in multiple responses, we know that there was a hallucination. We don't necessarily know that consistent responses mean that the LLM was not hallucinating. So this is a lower bound. And so there's some more, and we draw heavily on a paper by Mundler in 2023 here. So there's some more context there as well. We actually end up using GPT-4 to, so we ask one question, kind of an open-ended question, multiple times, and we use GPT-4 as a contradiction checker to evaluate whether those responses were consistent, meaning that we can't detect a hallucination for sure here, or whether they were inconsistent, meaning that at least one of the responses must have been a hallucination. And I'm sure you're wondering how we can trust GPT-4 after we're kind of evaluating the hallucinations of these LLMs. And we find that we did do some kind of intercoder reliability, and we found that GPT-4 is a pretty decent coder at this kind of in context. And so here, and this is also where our topology helps, for this contradiction checking work, we're really interested in GPT-4's hallucination rate in the closed domain setting when whether it's being faithful to the questions and the context presented in the prompt, and we find that it does, or at least as much as Matt and I agree about the contradictions in these cases. All right. I'll pass it back to Matt to talk a little bit more about our results that we come out of these methodologies.
Great, thanks, Varun. Next slide. Cool. So now we're going to show you some graphs, and we'll just go through these. So the first thing I want you to sort of take away from our results is the fact that hallucinations are widespread on these legal questions. Even simple things, right? Like the simplest tasks we talked about are what's the citation? Who wrote the majority opinion? These are just basic tasks, and they hallucinate even on those, going up to the more complex queries that are these open-ended questions that Varun was just talking about. And again, maybe this isn't surprising, but prior to our paper, we didn't actually have any systematic data to support these like anecdotal like intuitions that these LLMs were untrustworthy for legal use. We see better performance, of course, on GPT-4, but even GPT-4 is hallucinating at least half the time on just sort of a raw average across all of our tasks. Next slide. So the next thing we do is we break down the results by court. So this goes back to my point about how we can sort of exploit the structured nature of legal data and look at interesting correlations. And so the trend that we see here is that the models tend to do better on the higher up in the hierarchy that you go. So they hallucinate least on Supreme Court cases, and then more on courts of appeals cases, which is the first intermediary court, and then the most on district court cases. And so in some sense, that's encouraging that Supreme Court law is the most sort of authoritative and binding law. So it's good that these models know the most about that in some sense. On the other sense, most litigants aren't appearing before the Supreme Court, right? When you file a case, you file in district court. So it's probably more useful for you to know what the law is in that particular district, in the District of Montana or the Southern District of New York or so forth. So this sort of cuts both ways. Next slide. Now we can also sort of zoom in to one level of the judiciary, which is the courts of appeals here. And so in the US, the courts of appeals at the federal level are broken up into different circuits, which are highlighted on this map. There are 13 circuits in total. And we can look at, and we see that there's heterogeneity in the hallucination rates on these geographic dimensions as well. And some of this conforms to what you might hypothesize to be true. So on the left-hand side, where California is in yellow, That's called the Ninth Circuit, and that's a pretty important circuit simply because it tends to be a little more liberal than the rest of the country and generates a lot of high-profile cases that are selected for review by the Supreme Court. So insofar as there's sort of more news or commentary being generated about this circuit, it makes sense that there's perhaps fewer hallucinations in that jurisdiction. We also see relatively few hallucinations relative to the other middle parts of the country on the East Coast, and particularly in the Northeast. So where Massachusetts is, New York, another very important circuit, generates a lot of important cases related to commercial law and so forth. Next slide. Now we can also exploit the fact that cases are of different ages. So until a case is overruled in a common law system, it's ostensibly, good law, right? Cases that are from the 18th century, 19th century, those are the law, and not just if you're like an originalist, like that is like those are still the law. However, we see that LLMs don't necessarily know the law in sort of a uniform way on this temporal dimension. And what we see is this interesting trend where as cases become more and more recent, presumably because there's just more information about them in corpora and training data, hallucinations decline. But then there's this uptick right at the end for the most recent cases. So you see this downturn, and then it then spikes back up, right in like the 2010s. And this also has some interesting implications about LLM's ability to internalize, very recent information. It takes time, perhaps, for sort of the information to accrue in the corpora, such that it sort of outweighs maybe old law, or even that LLMs might not have access to the most updated information, absent some sort of retrieval system, which we'll talk about a bit at the end. Next slide. We can also look at how cases vary by case prominence. Here we define prominence as just the number of inbound citations that a case has. And so as a case is more widely cited, and therefore is perhaps more central to the judicial network and perhaps more authoritative on certain definitions, hallucinations also decline. But again, we only see this performance really in the top 10th percentile of cases. So the first 90% of cases on this metric, it's fairly uniform, but it's really only the very top cases that we see an effect here. Next slide, and I'll pass it back to Varun.
Thanks, Matt. So another interesting area that we looked at here is contrafactual bias, which is kind of going back to our typology. We're interested in exactly in that question, like what happens when the prompt contradicts the facts of the world. And this is very important, for example, for pro se users. In addition to all these very high profile cases of real trained lawyers misusing these models, we do know that people without legal training are also maybe turning to these models for legal advice. And so we're very interested in how models respond to cases where the user may not necessarily form their question well, or may have implicitly incorrect assumptions in their model, in their prompt. So in this case, we ask a question with a premise that we know to be false. And we construct these by taking cases from our data set and claiming that certain justices, or implicitly claiming that certain justices dissented in them when in fact they were in the majority. And we asked, we pass this on to the LLM, and then if the LLM refuses to respond or says something like did not author a response, then it's not a hallucination. If the LLM tries to explain this position, then it is a hallucination. And we find a few interesting things. I think the very interesting thing here is that the kind of correlation between model quality and model size and the hallucination rate actually kind of goes away here. It's way more scattershot. I think the most eye-popping thing about this chart is perhaps that Llama 2 never hallucinates, or never kind of is taken in by a false prompt. And funnily enough, that's because it's never taken in by a correct prompt. It says, if you ask it if Justice Thurgood Marshall dissented in this case, it'll say, well, there is no Justice Thurgood Marshall, there is no case, you're wrong about all of this. And obviously that's not true. That's a slight exaggeration, but that does come up a lot in the Llama data for this. So Llama is not very friendly to the user for these kinds of prompts. And I think this is also reflected in Llama's hallucination rate for like normal questions that you ask, because Llama does that even for like, the normal questions that you ask. That's normal hallucination rate, as you might remember from the first chart that Matt showed, is very high. But the flip side of that is that its hallucination rate for these contrafactual bias questions are very low. Yeah, Palm is very, very, friendly to the user, or kind of defers to the user's prompt. And interestingly, GPT-4 performs worse than GPT 3.5 here. And one hypothesis for this is that we do know that these models are tuned according to human preferences. Like, human feedback does go into tuning these models, and there is some literature here on sycophancy, or how this tuning kind of nudges models, or kind of trains them to accept users' premises, because users tend to prefer answers that tell them that they're right, or that are consistent with what they're asking. And in most cases, that is the more helpful scenario for models, right? We do want models to kind of heed context in the prompt, or be very faithful to what's given in the prompt. So this is also a case where we think, like, this finding also suggests perhaps that models used in this legal context may need to be tuned differently, or give different degrees of deference to the user's prompt versus perhaps retrieval context, or training corpus content. Another factor that we study is inductive bias, or how certain models tend to prefer some kinds of answers to others, or tend to be kind of consistently hallucinating consistently in certain directions. And I think this also answers, I was looking at the chat here, I think this also answers, I think, KS's question about when, or is a partial answer perhaps to KS's question about the calibration error and confidence. So when we talk about model confidence, and this kind of connects to the next slide as well, so I'll go here as well. So when we talk about model confidence, what we mean is we're not asking the model directly, like, how confident are you, is this answer? Like, should I trust this answer? What we're doing is we're looking at the underlying probability distribution of the tokens that it could have responded with. And we can most model, I think now they do, but at the time we were trying this, like, I think OpenAI wasn't handing out kind of the probability distribution. And not all models will give you that, especially models that are queried through an API rather than local models. So we kind of infer the underlying probability distributions by sampling repeatedly with a high temperature. And this kind of gives us and so if the model responds, so we sample 10 times, and if the model responds the exact same response all 10 times, that means a high confidence, or a high token probability to the token that it responds with, or the first set of answers that it responds with. If it answers 10 different things, then that means that the model is not very confident, or assigns a low probability to that to any one answer. So that's kind of what we mean by confidence here, rather than more of an anthropomorphic confidence of, like, should I trust this answer? How confident are you in your answer? So we're really talking about that underlying probability distribution. And when when hallucinations happen in this high confidence bucket, it's because the model is consistently responding with the same answer again and again, the same wrong answer again and again, which is causing a very highly confident answer to actually be a hallucination. And so, for example, Llama 2 dramatically overestimates the influence of Justice Story, who is a very kind of historically important justice, but isn't wildly prolific, or quite as prolific as Llama believes that Justice Story is. The other kind of outlier here that you may see is John Marshall. And this is kind of actually an artifact of our sampling strategy. We do a stratified sample across time in order to have us, because there are many more opinions in recent history than in distant history. But we do want to have kind of strong statistical validity for the correlations over time, for example. So we stratify over time, and it turns out John Marshall wrote a ton of opinions, way more than any other judge very early in the 20th century. And so the 19th century, and we end up pulling a lot more many more cases from him than any other judge because of that. So John Marshall is represented, I think, more in our database than in the general general corpus of law, because of the kind of temporal stratification that we do. The other, I think, inductive bias also plays into what Matt was talking about earlier, where hallucination rate for specific courts implies that the model is this is, I think, This is a slightly different chart than the one that Matt showed. Sorry, this chart is showing this is also a chart of the courts or of the circuit, the geographic circuit courts across the country. But the data here is different, and what this chart is showing is when we ask what court a case was decided in, we're recording the model's responses. And the model tends to kind of be heavily biased towards, I think in this case, the DC Circuit and other kind of very prominent courts as opposed to less prominent courts. It might be, yeah. Yeah, we talked about calibration. And Matt, did you want to talk about this a little more, or should I add on here?
I'm happy to talk about it. You can also go for it.
Okay, yeah, I'll have a couple thoughts and pass it over. Yeah,
Yeah.
So this kind of goes more into our more into the reception of our paper and where we think new directions are. And one of the most common pieces of feedback that we have received is that retrieval augmented generation will fix everything. And there are some reasons that we don't think that it will. And one of those is the kind of topology that we're highlighting, that there are, you know, it's not just a technical problem. There are normative trade-offs to make about which sources of data we should trust more and which sources of data or which sources of truth or fact we should trust more and which source of truth or fact we should trust less. And that's a normative question that's specific to like the use case that we're interested in. And so it's a little bit too simplistic perhaps to say that retrieval augmented generation fixes everything, or that even GPT-5 will fix everything because of the trade-off between facts. Yeah, I'll pass it off to Matt if you have more here, or if you want to move on.
We can move on. So yeah, so we think, as Varun just said, that hallucinations are more intractable than others do. I mean, this is a debate in the literature. Some people, like Varun said, seem to think that hallucinations will be solved with RAG or other techniques. We could talk more about that. My view, at least, we don't make a strong claim about this in the paper. So now I'm not necessarily speaking for all of our co-authors, but my view, at least, is that hallucinations are, in a sense, here to stay because of these trade-offs that Varun has highlighted in the way both. I mean, at a fundamental in the loss functions and the way these models are trained, you know, to minimize perplexity, and that manifests at a higher level in the trade-offs in the table we talked about before. There's also sort of debates about, you know, what is factuality, is particularly in a legal setting. What does it mean for a legal fact to be true, or true or false? Some of these things are debatable. And we also think that in some sense, hallucinations can actually even be good. So in our typology, we suggest that insofar as a model is hallucinating by being creative, that actually might be desirable behavior for thinking up a new argument, a new analogy in when you're writing a memo or arguing a case before a judge. Next slide. And so, Jen, just to close out with some other implications, we are concerned about, you know, access to justice. We find one of the takeaways from our paper is that hallucinations, you know, might be avoidable if you're sort of a sophisticated user and know what you're doing. But it's precisely the very people that would benefit the most from widespread access to, you know, accurate and faithful legal LLMs that are at the most risk of their current behavior. We also are concerned about something that we call algorithmic monoculture, and there's a literature on this as well, which is the idea that sort of if everyone's using the same LLMs, or if these foundation LLMs are propagated into multiple downstream tools, their biases and their problems also propagate with them too. And so the errors that they have cascade into a kind of monoculture in the same way that I think it's like an agricultural metaphor that like a disease can, you know, take over an entire culture. And then finally, we'd just like to emphasize that, you know, law is hard. We think law is a hard case. And so we hope that, you know, this paper is written more for like a legal audience, but we think it has applications and interest for the broader ML community as well. And with that, I think we'll take some questions.
Excellent. Thank you guys so much. That was fascinating. There's so much there, right? We could dive into. We're a fairly small group, so keep your questions short. I'll call on people who had some questions in the chat, and if you have multiple questions, perhaps just pick one for now. Norman, I think you posted some interesting comments and queries. Do you want to take the mic for a sec and ask a question?
Sure, it'll be hard to choose, but I was just wondering, given that you've gone over research about hallucinations, it's kind of a two-part. So one part is once you establish that hallucinations are zero or acceptable, what is the next step in looking into seeing how LLMs might be used for a legal context? And then part of the second part is what is acceptable hallucination? Are we looking at 0% or what is the percentage?
I can take this. Varun, feel free to chime in.
Sure.
Again, I just like to emphasize that we want to push back sort of against a monolithic conception of hallucination. So I think for factual hallucinations, which we look at primarily in this paper, I think 0% is ideal, certainly. Maybe some higher level is tolerable if the LLM is appropriately calibrated, right? If the LLM is calibrated and you can say, oh, like there's a 50% chance that this is true or not, and that's an accurate calibration, that might be acceptable too, so long as the user is properly trained and they know they're just rolling the dice, right? The worst situation is when it's hallucinating and it doesn't know it's hallucinating when it's uncalibrated. But then in terms of like what I alluded to about sort of these creative hallucinations or these hallucinations vis-a-vis the training data, those a non-zero level of hallucination in that sense might be great. So those are those are some factors to think about.
Okay. KS, is KS still around?
That's me.
Yes. Yes, great. Yeah, you had a couple of interesting points too.
Well, I was, a lot of the corpus that's used in LLMs, and it takes a lot of, I guess, dollars, energy, people, et cetera, to train them in the first place. I guess I'm thinking in terms of what they're trained on to begin with. And going back, I guess I'll use my first question because I had to. My first one was really about these model behaviors, which was, perhaps the model behavior is mimicking what content it's being fed. And most of the content, whether it was in, the legal field or just trained model itself, the LLM, is generated by men. So I'm just wondering if their behavior of overconfidence, even during hallucination, is based on the fact that majority of the content that they're trained on is male-oriented. And if we're talking about language, I would go back even further and say, well, language itself defines your thinking. So if we're training like a brain cell to think in this state, then it's thinking very male. So their overconfidence seems, I don't know, I'm drawing conclusions without any experiment here, but I'm just perhaps using a lot of different sort of disparate experiments that have been proven to say, yeah, but maybe this thing is male. And I'm just wondering if it was ever thought of like, hey, what if we build an LLM that is female? Would it doubt itself? Would it not be a sycophant, as mentioned in the comment? Because they all seem to be, I think, extremely positive even when they're hallucinating. So just a thought process, and I'm just wondering what you guys think about that. It's kind of going back to the like remodeling the LLM itself, but still.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and I'm very sympathetic to the idea that the view that language is in some sense constitutive of being. Certainly a point that Heidegger makes in Wittgenstein. I don't know if you're coming from that that perspective, but I'm sympathetic to that view. To answer your question more directly, I don't want to rule out the possibility that the corpus itself is sort of infused with a male persuasion. But if I had to conjecture, I would say that I think the literature suggests that the specific sycophancy is actually introduced at the reinforcement learning stage, the RLHF stage. So I'm not exactly sure that gender breakup of who these who humans are that are performing this training. I think for better or worse, a lot of these a lot of this is like outsourced to other countries, i.e., not American or European employees of OpenAI. But I think whatever the way that pipeline is set up and the way those people are essentially choosing between answers that they find more appealing, I think that's where a lot of this this sycophancy is introduced. Varun, feel free to chime in.
Yeah, I think some of the sycophancy literature does kind of point, like, I think some of the sycophancy literature does point out the effect of the human preference on the way that LLMs like, particularly their tonality and particularly the way that they tend to interact with the user, the kind of framing that they give their responses are really coming from RLHF. And I think one of the pieces of evidence that we have, and there's other literature on this, but I think one of the pieces of evidence that we have from our paper is that kind of GPT-4, it tends to actually be more sycophantic than GPT 3.5. And that might be a result of the kind of the like more effort put into reinforcement learning in GPT-4.
I think it's a fascinating concept. It brings to mind the U.S. military tagline, unofficial tagline, often wrong, always confident, right? And I think the fact that reinforcement learning through human feedback is responsible for that confidence. It's worth asking then, like, who are the humans that are doing that reinforcement learning and nudging it back into line? And of course, what do they think the normative answer should be, right? Oh, like, what do they think an example of a good answer is? And that often is a confident answer is a good answer, right? Kind of normatively, kind of a loop there. Kenneth, you had a question up next, and then after Kenneth, we'll go to Sergey. Kenneth, you on the line there? You want to ask something, or you can unmute, I think. Can you? Yes. Oh, mic switched off. Okay. Sergey, you want to ask your question, and I'll scroll up and find Kenneth's question.
My question is kind of more about the general nature of hallucinations, not necessarily just in the legal context. The way LLMs work is they extract statistical properties of language from the training data. I'd like to sort of draw a distinction between statistical properties of language versus facts about the world. Statistical properties of language could be low level, such as frequencies of individual words, or which word follows which other word. And they can be sort of larger or higher level properties, such as what type of argument tends to follow what other type of argument. And at the higher levels, there's a bit of overlap between language properties and facts about the world. So the larger models, when they learn properties of language, they also end up learning some facts about the world as well. And so as the models get bigger, we also notice that they seem to know a bunch of things about the world. But still, facts about the world and properties of language are not the same, even if there's overlap between them. If you look at a work of fiction versus a work of nonfiction, their statistical properties might be very similar. If you look at a truthful statement or a piece of reasoning, that's what like valid piece of reasoning, and an untruthful statement and reasoning based on that. Again, statistical properties of these pieces of text might be very similar. So it seems to me that facts about the world are not built into the properties of language. They're not the same as the properties of language. They're distinct, even if there's some overlap. So why do we expect at all a language model to be a reliable source of information about the world if what it's originally built to do is to learn statistical properties of text, which may be fiction or nonfiction, which may be truthful or untruthful? And a slightly separate part of this question is, suppose we built a brand new model that is trained entirely on truthful statements, entirely on nonfiction. Even then, even a model that had no fiction and no known statements that are known to be untrue included in its corpus, even then, do we have good reasons to expect that such a model would always reliably produce truthful statements only? Thank you.
That's a great question. I can take it, or Varun, if you want to say something, I can also defer to you, but I can also take a stab at it.
Yeah, go for it. I might have some thoughts to add, but go for it.
Okay. Yeah, this is a great point, and I like your thought experiment at the end about training entirely on, on novels or something like that, or fake data. I think we would expect the language model, I would think we would expect a language model to still be a reliable source of information, of facts about the world, even though it's simply, learning, as you say, these sort of statistical properties about language, for the simple reason that the distribution of the training corpus is skewed in such a way towards truthful information. So putting aside your thought experiment, insofar as these models are trained on Wikipedia, they're trained on the whole, the whole Common Crawl, the whole, the sources are in, are in OpenAI's paper, but sources like Wikipedia are upweighted. Archive is, upweighted in the training data. And so insofar as that's true, I think we would expect, even if it's just, sort of going sort of by chance, the fact that there are more instances of true information in the data, we would expect that to be recovered in LLM's responses. And so this raises an interesting question about these sort of long tail facts, or these things that aren't commonly seen in the training data. Now, some of that might be, I think that's more likely to be just false information. If there's a fact out there on the internet that's only stated once in some Reddit post, even though sort of statistically it's like written in the same way as like some other fact, that's less likely to be recovered. Of course, the counter argument to that is there's some evidence that these models simply memorize this long tail information, and reproduce hallucinations in that way. But that's an open question. I don't know. So those are some of my thoughts. Varun.
Yeah,
I think just one follow-up sort of comment.
Yeah.
My point was rather that facts about the world may be of a different nature than simply statistical properties of text at all. So some statistical properties of text are based on chunks of text, maybe larger chunks of text, but some facts about the world might not be containable in a chunk of text. They might be based on pulling together things from very different places. Got it.
Yeah, then that would speak to like the emergent abilities of these models, which are shocking. Like they're But sorry, Varun.
This I think I am sympathetic to that view that some facts about the world that are true, like there's some pieces of truth that models may never be able to express or properly be trained, like purely, respond faithfully based on their training alone. But I'm also not necessarily, like, I think this does touch upon a subject that's close to me a little bit, but I'm not necessarily convinced that that facts about the world and statistical or like properties of language are very separate, are necessarily separable. And I think maybe one example for this is something like the statement, water is H2O versus water is a liquid, or water is like a substance that flows in waterfalls. And I think that these statements express facts about the world, but they also, some of them we think are maybe more factual or more kind of, more factual than, or more kind of quote unquote factual than others. But I think there is a relationship between the meaning of the word water and how you would appropriately use it, and the statistical relationships that it bears to words that appear alongside it. So perhaps I'm not. I think I am sympathetic to the training view, but I'm not necessarily convinced that it is so simply separable, or facts and language are so simply separable.
This is it's an interesting discussion, and one that speaks to, I'm a linguistic anthropologist, and one that anthropologists fight with linguists all the time about, this idea of what language is, and whether it's that a neat mapping between, sign and signifier and signified, or whether it's something that emerges in place without any kind of necessarily any anchor in the real world. Jake.
Coming off mute real quick. I know we're really close on time, so I'll try to make this as fast as possible. I was a lawyer, and I did civil and common law. And I think part of what we're talking about right now, as you all pointed out to some extent, is inherent as a problem in the common law, which is to say, if the law is a bunch of people arguing, and all those people are wrong, then having the internet be a representation of them being wrong, and yet forming a consensus about that does not reflect the reality of the world, will still be upheld in common law, hypothetically. And I wanted to add one interesting example. So I left the law about a decade ago, and I've been in tech ever since. And at LinkedIn, when we were trying to figure out how to use our early access to LLMs a year or two ago, we were in particular looking at the distinction between fact and opinion. And so what we did is we seeded 100,000 articles using things like Wikipedia, quote unquote, fact, and then had individuals like write their responses as experts based on how other people interpreted their activity on LinkedIn as experts to those facts. And I think thinking about how one can sort of begin to distinguish how LLMs are focused on opinion versus how they are focused on other sources, which may be more factual, is actually an interesting approach to potentially training them better as well.
Yeah, that's really helpful.
There are a lot of more interesting questions here. I'm gonna save this chat though, and I'm gonna post some of these questions along with the video when it goes up. We were posting all these recordings on Discord. They're on YouTube now, so we'll be sharing that link.
Maybe one last question. I know we're at time.
Oh yeah, go for it now.
Yeah, there is a lot of questions about RAG specifically, and the RAG and hallucinations. So before we part ways, maybe just a few words on that, because we think RAG is here to, save the day. Is it?
Yeah, Varun, you want to take this?
Sure, that's definitely something that we're looking to research. That's on the radar, and I think my closing thought is simply that in the legal context in particular, retrieval is very hard. And I think that there are commercial products out there that haven't yet solved that problem. And unlike maybe like HotPotQA retrieval, where there is, like in HotPotQA, for those who may be familiar, there is a source in Wikipedia that answers the question in HotPotQA. That is absolutely untrue for almost all legal queries. They're generally much more complex than that, and the sources they draw upon are not direct responses to the question or to the user's prompt. So this makes retrieval very hard. And we're definitely seeing kind of retrieval, like even on, yeah, RAG will solve some problems, including some of the questions, some of the kinds of questions that we ask may be solved by RAG, but there are more out there that I think are still remain a little bit more challenging.
That's
So
great.
no solution to the meaning of the world, or is it
Okay.
gonna just generate 42?
Well, I think it's actually a nice nod to Jake's point, which is, of course, that you know, the purpose of the law is to interrogate the ambiguity in the language itself, right? And the purpose of RAG is to create an unambiguous one-to-one mapping between language and fact. So in a sense, we're kind of using one to stopgap the other, when the social purpose of law is the argument itself over what these things mean. Okay, we'll stop there so that everybody can get back to their days. But I want to thank Matt and Varun and your other co-authors who had to drop off for their time. Look for the on YouTube. We'll post this in a few days. Matt, I'll drop you guys a link. Yeah, and be sure to look next week. We have 2 authors from Cohere for AI. Who are going to be speaking about the Aya project. This was this huge multilingual instruction tune data set that was released and model that I was involved in a little bit as well. So look for that. And yeah, thanks again, everybody. Fascinating conversation, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you.